Flight attendant slaps. Black billionaire. Then learns she owns the entire airline. The slap echoed louder than any jet engine. It wasn't loud because of its sound. It was loud because of what it meant. There, in the soft-lit luxury of Flight RS-611's first-class cabin, where champagne flowed more freely than apologies, where white gloves served silence and superiority, a line had just been crossed that no turbulence could mask. The slap came from Lauren Kingsley, lead flight attendant, 43, known for her flawless uniform and colder-than-cocktail-ice demeanor, and it landed squarely on the cheek of a young black woman sitting in seat 1A, who, to everyone else in the cabin, was just another overconfident upgrade passenger. What no one knew, at least not yet, was that this woman, this calm, composed figure, with natural curls swept into a low chignon and a powder blue blazer, was Ray Jordan, the billionaire founder and majority owner of Skylux Air. Lauren's hand hovered in the air a moment too long. Her face had drained of color. She'd meant to humiliate. She hadn't meant to ignite a firestorm, but Ray didn't flinch. Didn't raise her voice. Didn't even touch her cheek. She just sat there, unmoving, eyes locked with Lauren's, cool, unyielding, and behind her silence, something ancient stirred, something generations deep, the kind of composure that comes from fighting battles without armor, from being denied respect and learning to carry it within yourself. "I'm going to say this one time," Ray said evenly. "Step away from me." The cabin was frozen. First class on a late afternoon Los Angeles to Chicago route was usually a sanctuary of hushed murmurs, clinking glasses, and private PowerPoint prep. But now, every phone was slowly lifted, every neck craned. Every assumption shattered. 20 minutes earlier, none of this had happened. 20 minutes earlier, Lauren had simply noticed a black woman walking through first class with a paper boarding pass and no designer luggage. Ray had taken her seat quietly. She hadn't asked for anything. She hadn't expected trouble. But trouble had walked up to her in heels and a fitted blazer with a name tag that read Kingsley. Lauren had leaned in with that sharp, practiced smile. "Ma'am, I'm afraid you're in the wrong seat. This section is reserved for priority-tier passengers only." Ray had smiled gently and handed her boarding pass without a word. Lauren didn't even look at it. "If you'd like, I can escort you to premium economy." "I believe I'll stay right here," Ray had said, folding her hands on her lap. That's when the dance began. Passive-aggressive reminders, requests for identification, subtle comments, then not-so-subtle ones. And finally, that moment when Lauren's professionalism broke like cheap glass. And now, here they were, in front of 40 strangers, all watching a flight attendant slap a woman who still hadn't raised her voice. "What's your badge number?" Ray asked quietly. Lauren blinked. "Excuse me?" "You heard me." Lauren stumbled a half-step back. Her voice cracked. "You can't talk to me like that." "You don't even belong here." At that exact moment, one of the passengers, a tech CEO named Greg Lawson, sitting in 1C, lowered his phone and asked, "You didn't check her name on the manifest?" Lauren shot him a look. "Of course I did." But Grace, a junior flight attendant lingering near the galley, suddenly spoke. Her voice was hesitant but firm. "She's on the manifest. Ray Jordan, seat 1A. Priority tier, Skylux executive clearance." Lauren turned furious. "Grace, she's on the list," Grace said again. "I checked it myself." There was a silence so thick it felt physical. Someone gasped. Someone else whispered, "Wait, Ray Jordan? Like the Skylux founder?" Greg looked over at Ray again, brow furrowed. "You're Ray Jordan, the one from the Fast Company cover story?" Ray nodded once. I am. The shift in the cabin was instant. The air changed. The balance of power tilted so hard it nearly snapped. Lauren's face went pale. She stepped back, her hands shaking slightly. I didn't know. You weren't listed as the CEO. You thought what? Ray's voice cut like ice. That a black woman in a simple blazer couldn't possibly belong here. No, that's not what I... But it was. Everyone knew it. Across the aisle, Megan Caldwell, a PR executive who'd once smiled politely as Ray was being questioned, now looked down at her hands in shame. And Lauren? Lauren opened her mouth to speak again, but Ray stood up. Slowly, with purpose, she turned to the rest of the passengers. Let me make something very clear. I didn't come here to make a scene. I came to fly on my own airline. Quietly, without fanfare, without special treatment. But what I got today wasn't policy, it wasn't protocol, it was profiling. It was humiliation, and it was illegal. She turned back to Lauren. You assaulted me. On my plane, in front of 40 witnesses. And you did it not because of my behavior, but because of what you assumed about me when you looked at me. Lauren's lips trembled. I didn't mean... You did, Ray interrupted, her voice now ringing clear and strong. And now you'll face the consequences. At that moment, the captain's voice came over the intercom, slightly breathless. This is Captain Ellison. We've been informed of a level 1 security incident in the cabin. We'll be diverting to Denver for emergency resolution. Lauren's knees buckled slightly. She looked like she might faint. Greg muttered under his breath, You're gonna need a lawyer. From the galley, Grace stepped forward again, this time with more confidence. Miss Jordan, I want you to know, I saw what happened. And I should have spoken sooner. I'm sorry. Ray looked at her, and for the first time that day, her expression softened. Thank you, Grace. For telling the truth, it still matters. The plane banked slightly. The cabin lights flickered. The passengers were no longer just observers, they were witnesses. And in a world of silence and complicity, they were being forced to choose. The truth had landed, but the reckoning, it was still taxiing toward them. Ray sat down again, calm as ever. She opened her tablet and typed a single message to her executive team. Incident in progress, slap recorded. Flight RS611. I'll handle the press. Start HR termination procedures for Kingsley. She hit send, then leaned back in her seat, eyes closed, expression unreadable. The skies had always belonged to the powerful, but today, someone powerful had come to reclaim them, with nothing more than a boarding pass, a spine of steel, and a slap heard around the world. The landing was abrupt. No one clapped. No one breathed. The wheels screeched against the Denver tarmac with a sharpness that matched the mood in first class. As the aircraft slowed and turned toward a secluded hangar instead of the main terminal, the tension snapped taut like piano wire. Inside the cabin, Ray Jordan didn't move. Lauren Kingsley, now seated stiffly in the jump seat with her eyes glassy and hands folded too tightly in her lap, kept her gaze fixed straight ahead, as though looking anywhere else might shatter what little control she still clung to. The silence was broken only by the muted chime of the seatbelt sign switching off. The cabin crew stood frozen. Then, over the PA, Captain Ellison's voice came on again, softer now, but heavy with finality. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain in your seats. Ground security is boarding. This is a controlled disembarkation due to an onboard incident. We thank you for your cooperation. A murmur rippled through the first-class cabin. A few passengers leaned in toward each other, whispering about what had happened. Others avoided eye contact entirely, ashamed of how long they'd stayed quiet. Then came the real twist. As the cabin door opened, two security officers in dark navy uniforms stepped in. They didn't go to Ray. They went directly to Lauren. "Ms. Kingsley," the older of the two said, his voice firm but formal. "Please come with us." Lauren blinked. Her mouth opened, then closed. "What? Why?" "I didn't do anything illegal. This is a misunderstanding. I didn't know who she was," the younger officer replied. "That's not the issue." Lauren looked around, desperate. "Wait, hold on. I've worked for this airline for 12 years. I've served diplomats, celebrities, royalty. I've received commendations." Ray finally looked up. "And now, Lauren," she said calmly, "you'll receive something else. Consequences." Lauren turned to Ray, her voice cracking. "You set me up. You hid who you were on purpose." "I did," Ray said without apology, "because people like you treat power with respect and treat everyone else with suspicion. I wanted to see how you'd act when you thought I was no one." The older officer gestured again. "Ma'am." Lauren rose shakily, her composure shredded. Her perfect uniform now looked like a costume that no longer fit. She paused before stepping off the plane, turning toward the passengers who were now all watching her. "I didn't mean to cause offense. I was just doing my job." Greg Lawson scoffed. "Slapping someone isn't in your job description." Ray didn't say another word. Lauren walked off the plane under escort, the door closing behind her with a dull, final hiss. The moment hung. Then someone clapped, just once, then again. The cabin didn't erupt in applause, but it rippled with it, a slow, uncertain surge of solidarity. A few passengers looked embarrassed. Others joined in, but the most surprising came from seat 3A. An older white woman with pearl earrings and a pale blue scarf leaned over her armrest, voice soft but sincere. "Ms. Jordan," she said, "I watched what happened, and I didn't speak up." "I want to say I'm sorry, that was wrong." Ray turned. "Thank you." "It means something, truly." Across the aisle, Grace, still holding the passenger manifest like a lifeline, finally stepped forward. "I knew who you were," she said quietly, not meeting Ray's eyes. "The moment you boarded, I saw the code on your reservation. Executive owner override. I should have said something sooner." I froze. Ray studied her. "You didn't freeze," she said. "You hesitated." "And you came forward when it mattered." Grace's voice cracked. "Is that enough?" "No," Ray replied honestly. "But it's a start." Captain Ellison entered the cabin moments later, removing his cap, his face unreadable. He stood next to Ray. "Ms. Jordan," he said, "I've just been briefed." "On behalf of the crew, I apologize." Ray stood slowly. "Captain, I don't need apologies." He blinked, uncertain. "I need change," she finished. A short pause. Then the captain nodded. "Understood." The ground team announced a staggered disembarkation. Ray, as the flight's highest-ranking passenger, was given the option to deplane first, but she refused. "No," she said. "Let everyone off. I'll be last. I'm not above anyone here." As the cabin emptied, one passenger after another glanced back at her with different expressions. Curiosity, guilt, respect, even admiration, even Daniel, the quiet businessman in seat 2C, who had remained a silent observer until the slap, paused beside Ray before exiting. "You know," he said, "in 20 years of flying, I've never seen someone turn an entire power dynamic upside down with just presence." Ray gave a small smile. "Sometimes, presence is all you've got." When the cabin was empty and only she and Grace remained, Ray turned to the young flight attendant. "Can I ask you something?" Ray said. Grace nodded quickly. "What made you finally speak?" Grace swallowed. "Because I realized silence was worse. And because someday I want to be someone who deserves to wear this uniform. Ray looked at her for a long moment. Then she handed Grace a business card. Come see me at HQ next week. Ask for the Director of People and Culture. Tell them I sent you. Grace's eyes widened. Are you offering me? I'm offering you a clean start. One built on the right kind of courage. Outside the terminal, cameras had already gathered. Someone had leaked the diversion to the press. Ray stepped out into the evening air, shoulders back, eyes forward. She didn't flinch at the flashes. She didn't hide behind PR handlers. She walked calmly to the black SUV waiting with the Skylux logo on the license plate. Inside, her chief of staff, Yvette, was already scrolling through her tablet. We've got requests for statements from CNN, MSNBC, The Journal, even a piece brewing on Vox. Everyone's heard about the slap. They want to know if it's true. Ray leaned back against the seat. Tell them it happened, she said. But don't call it a scandal. What should we call it then? Yvette asked. Ray looked out the window. A reckoning. The next morning, the world was watching. By 8:12 a.m., the slap had gone viral. The footage, filmed from 2 angles by passengers in first class, was on every major platform. One clip on TikTok had already passed 6 million views. A YouTube video titled "Flight Attendant Slaps Wrong Woman" was trending across North America. Even conservative talk shows and late-night comedy hosts had found their way into the narrative. Some mocking Lauren Kingsley, others questioning how someone so high up could remain unrecognized. In her penthouse suite overlooking downtown Denver, Ray Jordan stood barefoot by the window, coffee in hand, her phone vibrating with non-stop alerts. She ignored them all. Downstairs, her PR team had assembled for an emergency meeting. Ray descended like gravity itself. No rush, no drama, only control. Yvette, her chief of staff, stood at the head of the table with 4 phones, 2 laptops, and a legal notepad already half filled with scribbles. Morning, Ray, she said. You've got MSNBC online too. The NAACP wants to set up a call, and the Department of Transportation sent a preliminary inquiry. Everyone wants a piece of the story. Ray took a seat at the end of the table. Then let's decide what we're giving them. David Simons, head of legal, adjusted his tie. If you go public today, you'll own the narrative. You've already got public sympathy, but we don't want to overplay the victim card. I'm not a victim, Ray said, calm. And we're not doing a pity campaign. We're doing something different. Yvette nodded. We lean into accountability, not just for Lauren, but for the culture that created her. A beat of silence passed. Ray leaned forward, folding her hands. Let's do it. Press conference. Today at noon. David frowned. That's fast. She hit me in front of 41 people, Ray said. But the real story is what didn't happen. No one stopped her. That silence speaks louder than the slap. Across town, Lauren Kingsley sat in her apartment, blinds drawn, mascara streaked under her eyes. She hadn't slept. Her phone had been ringing all night, from unknown numbers, reporters, even her own mother. But she hadn't answered any of them. She was still trying to process what had happened. Not just the slap, but the reveal. Ray Jordan, billionaire CEO of Skylux Airlines. The woman Lauren had dismissed, degraded, and finally humiliated in front of a full cabin. It made no sense. Why had Ray been there in the first place, unannounced, in disguise? That question haunted her. Then came the knock at the door. Not firm. Not polite. Reluctant. Lauren opened it to find a woman in a sleek grey coat and wire-frame glasses holding a brown envelope. You're being served, the woman said flatly. notice of termination, and a cease and desist on all public statements related to the incident. Lauren's fingers trembled as she took the envelope. The woman hesitated before leaving. They're saying you struck her out of bias. Is that true? Lauren's throat tightened. I didn't know who she was. Does it matter? The woman asked, then turned and walked away. At 11:58 a.m., the press gathered inside Skylux HQ's glass atrium. Reporters packed the rows, cameras buzzed, and a few protesters already held up signs outside. Dignity at 30,000 feet, and flying shouldn't mean judging. At exactly noon, Ray Jordan walked out. She wore no makeup, no jewelry, just a charcoal blazer over a crisp blouse and dark jeans. Behind her stood Grace Holloway, her head slightly bowed, and next to her, Captain Ellison in full uniform. Ray approached the podium without notes. Yesterday, I boarded one of my own planes under a priority code that identifies me to staff as an anonymous executive observer. It's something I've done for years. To see firsthand what kind of culture we've built, what kind of company we truly are. She paused. A few shutters clicked. I've seen great service. I've seen kindness. But yesterday I saw something else. Something that's lived in the corners of our industry for too long. Bias, hidden under professionalism. Power used as a shield for cruelty. And silence mistaken for neutrality. The room was still. She continued. When Lauren Kingsley looked at me, she didn't see a customer. She didn't see a woman. She saw what she decided didn't belong. And for that, I hold her responsible. But I also hold myself accountable. Because culture starts at the top. Murmurs. She gestured toward Grace. This is Grace Holloway. She was there. She spoke up, not immediately, but when it counted. Grace flushed but didn't speak. Starting today, Skylux will undergo a company-wide reform, beginning with leadership training and a new dignity-first service model. We're not fixing a public relations issue. We're fixing the broken habits that led us here. A hand went up. Ms. Jordan, was this a stunt to expose Lauren? Ray replied evenly. No. This was me being treated the way millions of people are treated every day. I just happened to have the resources to speak back. Another reporter asked, Do you forgive her? Ray was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Forgiveness isn't the point. Accountability is. Outside the building, the crowd had grown. Inside the atrium, as Ray stepped down from the podium, a woman in the front row rose. Late 60s, silver curls, and a Skylux lapel pin. A retired flight attendant. She raised her hand slowly. Ms. Jordan, she said, voice steady. I worked in this industry for 40 years. We used to think keeping people comfortable was about hand towels and meal service. But I've never seen someone teach dignity like you just did. Ray nodded, humbled. Thank you. The woman smiled. Now it's our turn to teach it back. Back at her office, Yvette closed the blinds and passed Ray a folder. We've had over 400 job applications since the press conference. Most of them mention what happened on Flight 242. They want to be part of the change. Ray opened the folder and flipped through names. Then she stopped at one. Grace Holloway? She applied. Ray smiled. Call her. Let's bring her in. And with that, the tides began to shift. Quietly, steadily, but unmistakably. Not with noise, but with presence. It had been only 3 days since Ray Jordan's press conference, but the ripple effect was already rewriting the air industry's culture. At Skylux's Denver HQ, reform wasn't just a word tossed into memos. It was war, quiet, administrative war, policies redlined, hiring systems audited. And in the center of it all, Ray moved like a scalpel, precise, steady, cutting through decades of corporate rot that had learned to wear expensive suits and call itself tradition. But not everyone welcomed the change. In a sleek conference room on the executive floor, Ray sat across from three men in $1,000 suits, board members with tenure longer than most pilots had been alive. One of them, Charles Whitford, exhaled sharply and adjusted his cufflinks. "We appreciate your commitment to transparency, Ray. But this crusade, it's making shareholders nervous." Ray folded her arms. "Shareholders should be more nervous about silence than honesty." Another board member, Mitchell Crane, leaned in. "You've already fired Kingsley. You've promised reform. Isn't that enough?" Ray didn't blink. "No." Because Lauren wasn't an anomaly. She was a symptom. And we're not treating symptoms anymore. The room stiffened. But before anyone could push further, Ray slid a folder across the table. Inside were printed screenshots, internal employee chats, anonymous HR complaints, cabin reports, all referencing instances of microaggressions and selective service patterns that had gone unaddressed. "This is what we're really dealing with," Ray said quietly. Charles looked down at the pages. His jaw tightened. "Some of these are old. Does that make them irrelevant?" Ray asked. He didn't answer. Back in the training wing, Grace Holloway sat in a small classroom surrounded by a dozen other newly recruited flight attendants. Their faces were young, diverse, unsure. Their trainer, a stern woman named Naomi Diaz, pointed to a whiteboard where 4 bold words were written: presence, perception, power, and prejudice. Naomi turned. "Anyone want to tell me which of these got ignored on Flight 242? Grace raised her hand. "All of them," she said. "Presence was dismissed. Perception was warped. Power was abused, and prejudice ran the show." Naomi nodded. "Exactly. That's why you're here. Not just to serve orange juice and buckle belts. You're here to stand between silence and harm." That night, Ray received a call from a restricted number. She hesitated, then answered. A deep voice greeted her. "Ms. Jordan, my name is Lieutenant Vaughn Fields. I'm a federal liaison with the Aviation Civil Conduct Authority. We'd like to open a formal investigation into systemic bias across domestic air carriers. We want Skylux to lead the advisory panel." Ray's brow lifted. "You think we're the cleanest house on the block?" "You're the only one who opened your windows," he replied. "That's more than anyone else is willing to do." Ray thought for a moment. Then she said, "Send me the details." "I'm in." The next morning, her inbox exploded. A leaked email thread, originating from Lauren Kingsley's private account, had surfaced. In it, she mocked passengers from underprivileged neighborhoods, vented about having to act polite to nobodies, and even referred to Ray herself in thinly veiled terms, calling her a quota queen with an ego complex. The media pounced. Hashtags lit up again. Not just one slap. Bias in the skies. Inside Skylux HQ, Ray stood beside her legal counsel, reading the leaked email in silence. The room felt colder now, even with sunlight pouring in. Yvette appeared in the doorway. "Do we respond?" Ray looked up. "We don't respond. We act." By midday, a public statement went live. Effective immediately, Skylux Airlines would partner with 3 historically black universities to develop a new leadership pipeline for women and people of color in aviation. The Ray Jordan Aviation Fellowship would fund 50 full-ride scholarships annually. Applications opened that same afternoon. News outlets scrambled to cover it. CNN aired a feature titled, "From Slap to Systemic Change, How One Woman is Rewriting the Skies." Ray didn't watch the interviews. She didn't sit for praise. She sat with her father. Thomas Jordan, retired postal worker, slow to speak, steady in his ways, poured coffee into two mismatched mugs in Ray's kitchen. He placed one in front of her, then settled in across the table. "I saw what happened," he said finally. Ray nodded. "It's been a week." He studied her. "You did the right thing. But you look tired, baby." Ray let out a short laugh. "That obvious?" Thomas sipped his coffee. "Doing right doesn't mean you don't bleed a little." She looked at him. "When Mom died, you said something I never forgot. That people won't always thank you for standing your ground, but someday they'll stand where you stood." He smiled faintly. "You remembered that? Every time I felt like sitting down." Thomas reached into his pocket and pulled out an old photo. It was Ray at 16, holding her first pilot license, grinning beside her mother. "She'd be proud, you know," he said. Ray swallowed a lump in her throat. Then her phone buzzed again. An alert. A private aviation firm, Helix Sky Holdings, had just filed a formal acquisition offer for Skylux Airlines, hostile. Backed by venture capitalists, and at the top of the consortium, Richard Garnett, a name Ray knew all too well, her former mentor. The same man who once told her, "You can be brilliant, Ray, just not too loud about it." She stared at the screen, heart pounding. The battle for dignity had just become a war for control. And Ray Jordan wasn't backing down. Ray Jordan stood in the center of the Skylux war room, a sleek glass-paneled conference space that now pulsed with quiet urgency. The hostile acquisition offer from Helix Sky Holdings had detonated like a grenade inside the upper ranks. Phones buzzed, legal teams scrambled, and somewhere inside all the chaos, Ray's breath was steady, measured like a pilot coming through turbulence. But no one else in the room felt calm. "They're offering a premium buyout," said CFO Darren Markey, adjusting his glasses nervously. 30% over market. "On paper, it's generous." Ray shot him a look. "It's bait. Garnett doesn't want Skylux." "He wants me gone." Yvette added flatly, "They're framing it as a cultural course correction. He just went on record saying Skylux has been overcorrecting for political optics." A murmur passed around the room. "That's coded," Ray said. And not even subtle. Behind her, a screen showed the Helix Sky proposal, flashing phrases like reviving legacy values, streamlined executive vision, and non-disruptive transition. She pointed to it. "They're not buying this airline. They're trying to buy silence. They want to muzzle the reform before it spreads." Darren leaned forward. "So what's our play? Do we fight?" Ray didn't answer right away. Her fingers tapped slowly on the table. Then she said, "We go public, but not with outrage, with proof. We show them this isn't about me. It's about everything they're trying to bury." Yvette raised an eyebrow. "Proof of what exactly?" Ray's gaze narrowed. "Of how far Garnett's network reaches. Of the surveillance programs he pitched to Homeland. The same tech he embedded into Helix Sky's private fleet last year." The room fell silent. "You're saying this is bigger than an airline," someone said. "I'm saying it always was." That night, Ray met Jamal Carter in a quiet diner just off East Colfax Avenue. He was her former cybersecurity director, fired by Garnett himself 2 years ago under mysterious circumstances. He slid into the booth across from her, wearing a hoodie and an old Broncos cap pulled low. "I heard you're swinging at giants again," he said with a dry smile. "You still have the files?" Ray asked. Jamal pulled out a flash drive. "Encrypted, but yeah." "All of it. The backdoor code Garnett wrote for Helix Sky's navigation systems, the cloaked data pings. Even the beta AI logs." "Why haven't you released it?" "Because no one listens unless the right person speaks," he said, sliding the drive across the table. "That person's you now." Ray took it without a word. The next morning, a storm broke across the aviation world. A whistleblower blog post appeared under the title, "The Sky Isn't Safe When It's Wired to Lie." Within hours, thousands were reading it. Screenshots, files, network maps. It painted a chilling picture. A for-profit airline infrastructure being quietly used to harvest behavioral data from passengers under the guise of flight efficiency. At the center of the scheme, Helix Sky Holdings. By noon, a subcommittee from the Senate called for an emergency review. And Ray? She walked into a shareholder town hall live stream and stood alone at the podium.
"My name is Ray Jordan. I'm not a PR product. I'm not a quota. I am a systems engineer who worked my way from regional ground staff to the top of this airline, and I know exactly what Helix Sky intends to do." She paused. "They aren't trying to save Sky Lux. They're trying to reverse everything we've done to make this industry more human. They want a world where first class is a fortress and justice is checked in at the gate." The chat feed exploded with hearts, claps, and thousands of usernames echoing one phrase: "We fly with Ray." In a corner office across town, Richard Garnett watched the stream unfold. His expression never changed. Calm. Cool. But his phone didn't stop ringing. Investors wanted answers. His legal team wanted reassurance. And all he had was silence. At Skylux HQ, Grace Holloway stood with a group of new flight attendants. She held a small envelope, an invitation from Ray, personally requesting her presence at a press conference the next day. When she opened it, a handwritten note fell out. It read, "Because silence was never your job, speak." Tears welled in her eyes. The next morning, Ray stood before a packed auditorium filled with media, employees, regulators, and union reps. She didn't unveil a product. She didn't quote numbers. She called up Grace. Grace stepped up, her voice trembling at first. "I was told to be quiet. To let things go. But the day I stayed silent would have made me complicit. I spoke because dignity is never optional, not for passengers and not for us." Applause broke out. And then Ray returned to the mic. She said only this: "You tried to erase me with a slap, but I don't vanish. I multiply." Behind her, the screen changed. It showed the names of 50 women of color currently in Skylux's leadership training program. Their faces, their stories. Ray turned toward the cameras. "To Garnett, and every hand that tried to rewrite this story, I hope you're watching. Because this flight just took off, and I'm not the only one flying anymore." The room rose, and so did the movement. The newsroom at WNN was a circus of ringing phones and news tickers when Ray Jordan stepped through the back entrance with Yvette by her side. Cameras were already being set up in Studio B for a surprise primetime special. The network had moved fast. Ray had agreed to the exclusive interview under one condition: no edits, no spin. Inside the green room, Ray sat alone, microphone clipped to her lapel, her palms resting lightly on her knees. Her mind wasn't on the cameras. It was on the lives behind the headlines, the flight attendants texting her thank you messages, the engineers who used to hide their accents, the little girl who once wrote her a letter saying, "I want to fly, but they say girls like me don't." That letter still sat in Ray's wallet. The host, veteran anchor Marcus Dillon, walked in minutes before airtime, a man used to breaking scandals and babysitting politicians. But as he shook Ray's hand, he paused, genuinely searching her face. "You know," he said, "they're saying you brought down the most untouchable man in the skies." Ray responded evenly. "I didn't bring him down. The truth did. I just refused to look away." The countdown began. 10,
9. 8. The red light blinked on. The broadcast began with a calm introduction, but within 5 minutes, Marcus asked what everyone was waiting for. "Why didn't you tell anyone you owned the airline the day you were assaulted on that flight?" Ray didn't flinch.
Because if I had, the story would have become about a CEO being insulted. But that wasn't the point. I wanted people to see what happens when someone isn't important enough to be treated with basic decency.
She leaned forward slightly. The lesson had to hit first. The reveal came after. The broadcast continued live for nearly 45 minutes. Ray dismantled Garnett's surveillance program with clarity. She outlined her ethics reform plan. She read Grace Holloway's note on air. And then, in a twist no one expected, she paused and addressed Garnett directly. "Richard, I know you're watching. You told me once behind closed doors that some people need to stay in their place. Well, here I am, in my place, leading." The feed went silent. Then Marcus asked, "Do you fear retaliation, legal or otherwise?" Ray nodded slightly. "Of course. Men like Garnett don't just go away, but he made a mistake. He taught me how the system works. I use that knowledge to fix it." The interview ended. Social media exploded. Shajt Fly with Ray hit trending #1 globally. Back at Helix Sky headquarters, Garnett's boardroom turned into a battlefield. Leaked files had triggered an internal investigation. The Department of Transportation issued an emergency hold on all Helix Sky expansion contracts. Stock plummeted. Inside his glass office, Garnett paced like a lion circling its cage. His assistant entered with a pale face. "Sir, the DOJ just requested you for a private hearing, and—" She hesitated. "We've been suspended from the FAA Innovation Council indefinitely." Garnett slammed his hand against the window. "She thinks this ends with me." His legal advisor didn't look up. "No, but it starts with you." Meanwhile, at Skylux, Ray stepped out onto the tarmac of a small private airfield where a youth aviation camp had gathered. Dozens of kids, mostly Black and Latino, swarmed her with notebooks, questions, and shy smiles. Among them was the little girl from the letter, now 11, beaming up at her. Ray kneeled down. "Remember what you wrote me?" The girl nodded. "I want to fly." "You still do?" "More than ever." Ray smiled. "Good." "Because the sky just got bigger, and it belongs to you too." That night, Ray returned home to find Grace waiting at her doorstep. No cameras. No microphones. Just two women who had once stood on opposite ends of a cabin and now shared a single mission. Grace took a deep breath. "I was scared. I still am, but I want to testify." "Not for you. For every person who stayed quiet because they thought silence was safer." Ray stepped aside, holding the door open. "Then let's make it count." Somewhere in the distance, a private jet blinked against the sky, its luxury lights dim against the night. Inside it sat Richard Garnett, staring at his phone, replaying Ray's interview in silence. Not out of anger now, but fear. The storm he thought he controlled had become a movement. And it had a name. Ray Jordan. The courthouse steps in downtown Washington, D.C. were crawling with press, like flies drawn to the scent of power. The marble pillars stood tall, but the air was thick with something heavier than humidity, anticipation. This wasn't just another corporate hearing. This was the kind of day that carved names into history books. Ray Jordan exited the black SUV wearing a slate-gray suit that fit like armor. No entourage, no legal circus, just Yvette at her side and a quiet confidence that settled over her like a second skin. She didn't speak to the cameras. She didn't need to. Her silence said everything. Inside, the hearing chamber buzzed with murmurs as senators, aviation executives, and federal regulators took their seats. Richard Garnett was already at the long oak table flanked by 2 defense lawyers and trying not to sweat through his designer suit. He offered Ray a curt nod. She didn't return it. Senator Elaine Rowe, chair of the Transportation Ethics Committee, rapped her gavel. This is a formal federal inquiry into the ethical, legal, and procedural violations connected to Helix Sky Holdings' bid for acquisition, alleged surveillance practices, and the systemic discrimination that has come to light within the commercial airline industry. We are joined by Ms. Ray Jordan, CEO of Skylux Airlines. Ray approached the microphone, adjusted it, and took a breath. "This isn't about me," she began, voice low but resonant. "This is about the system that taught employees to measure passengers by skin tone and zip code, about data collected without consent, dignity stripped in silence, and profits built on prejudice. I came here today not to defend a brand, but to demand accountability for all of us." She paused. You could have heard a paperclip drop. Senator Rowe leaned in. "Ms. Jordan, did you knowingly use a disguised boarding protocol to observe flight staff?" "Yes." "Why?" "To see how people were treated when they weren't recognizable, when they weren't assumed to be important." "And what did you find?" Ray turned her head slightly, locking eyes with Garnett. "That those assumptions are the problem." A ripple moved through the chamber. Then came the moment everyone had been bracing for. "Ms. Jordan," a male senator with thinning grey hair adjusted his glasses, "there's been concern that your leadership style is reactive. That you're using this moment to consolidate influence." Ray didn't blink. "Reactive would have been firing Lauren Kingsley and sweeping it under the rug. What I did was corrective. And uncomfortable as that might be, it's necessary, because pretending the system isn't broken doesn't make it whole." Garnett's attorney stood. "Objection to framing. This hearing isn't a courtroom. There's been no criminal charge levied against Mr. Garnett. Yet," Ray interjected coolly. That one word cut the air like a scalpel. Several people in the gallery audibly gasped. Garnett's lips tightened. Then came the evidence. Ray passed a folder to the clerk, who distributed copies to the senators. Inside were Jamal Carter's findings, detailed logs, access trails, metadata reports, proof that Garnett had used Helix Sky's flight systems to collect personal behavioral data on over 180,000 passengers. The room exploded in chatter. Senator Rowe pounded the gavel. "Order!" Richard leaned toward his attorney, whispering harshly. His hands shook. The whispering turned to pleading. The mask of indifference was gone now. This was the look of a man watching his empire crumble in real time. Back in the gallery, Grace Holloway sat beside Naomi Diaz and several new recruits from the Skylux Training Academy. She leaned forward, whispering, "I've never seen him scared before." Naomi smirked. "That's not fear of punishment. That's fear of no longer controlling the story." Meanwhile, outside the courthouse, the crowd swelled. Protesters held signs that read, "Dignity isn't a luxury. Bias at 30,000 feet is still bias. And we're not just passengers, we're people." Ray exited to thunderous applause. A young journalist pushed forward through the crowd. "Ms. Jordan, is this the end of the Garnett era?" Ray glanced over her shoulder at the courthouse behind her. "No," she said. "It's the start of ours." That evening, Garnett was placed under formal investigation by the DOJ for data misuse and violation of federal aviation laws. His personal assets were frozen pending audit. Several of Helix Sky's investors dropped out within hours. At Skylux HQ, the mood was almost celebratory, but Ray kept it grounded. In the atrium, she stood before her team. "We didn't win a battle," she said.
We exposed one, and now we do the real work. She then unveiled the Skylux Accountability Charter, a document co-authored with union leaders, civil rights attorneys, and passengers. It outlined everything from ethical hiring to transparent reporting systems, conflict resolution protocols, and third-party audits. It wasn't a PR stunt, it was a blueprint. The crowd broke into applause, real, thunderous applause. Grace stood near the back, a clipboard in hand, misty-eyed. She wasn't the unsure flight attendant anymore. She was now Director of Culture and Onboarding. Later that night, Ray sat on the rooftop of her condo, the skyline a quiet hum behind her. She scrolled past news headlines, some praising, some skeptical, but then she stopped at a photo. It was her, stepping off that plane in Denver, head high, shoulders square, alone, but not really. Next to the photo, a comment read, "She didn't ask for permission." She demanded respect, and we all watched the skies shift. Ray put the phone down, a rare smile tugging at the corner of her lips. One flight had changed everything. And yet, the journey had only just begun. The sun crept across the floor of the Skylux boardroom in long golden stripes, cutting through the high-glass windows as if nature itself had come to witness what would unfold. It was a full house. Executives, media, regulators. Even union reps who once distrusted everything Ray Jordan stood for. The air was packed with anticipation. Though no one dared speak above a whisper, the final hearing on the Aviation Ethics Reform Bill was minutes away from being live-streamed nationwide. And at its center stood Ray. She wasn't nervous. She was ready. Yvette stood to her right, tablet in hand, whispering final details. "Your father's watching from the community center in Oakland. CNN's confirmed simulcast."
FAA reps are on floor 2. Garnett's camp sent a statement. He's resigning from all aviation-related boards, effective immediately. Ray nodded once. Let's finish this. At 10 o'clock a.m., sharp, she stepped into the auditorium. No grand entrance, no fanfare. Just quiet footsteps echoing on polished tile, the calm gravity of someone who had turned turbulence into testimony. When she reached the podium, she paused, not to breathe, not to prepare, but to feel. Feel the weight of every voice that had been silenced before hers, every shoulder that had slumped under bias, every hand that had typed anonymous complaints only to be ignored. Today wasn't about vindication. It was about visibility.
"My name is Ray Jordan," she began, eyes scanning the audience. "And I stand here not because I'm a CEO, not because I went viral,
but because I refused to let a slap define what silence had been doing for years." A hush. I was told to move to economy. Told I didn't belong.
Told by a system, through one woman's hand, that my worth was negotiable. She shifted her tone. But dignity is not negotiable, and silence is no longer acceptable. Behind her, a screen lit up.
Footage played, clips from passenger interviews, training reforms, the Skylux Charter, Grace Holloway's testimony, even footage of Garnett's board crumbling in real time. Then came the final twist. The footage cut to something no one expected. Ray's original application to Skylux Airlines. 18 years old, airport ground crew, her handwriting crooked but determined.
Her words. "I want to help people fly, even when the world tries to keep them grounded." The room choked up. Ray continued. "I never imagined that lifting luggage in my teens would one day lead me to lift a mirror to this industry. But I do believe this. Every injustice we hide becomes part of the flight plan. Every small cruelty, every ignored complaint, every person profiled, those are the hidden passengers in every seat." She paused, letting it sink in.
And it's time we landed something better. The room burst into applause. Not the polite corporate kind. The kind that grows in waves. The kind that starts in the gut and lifts into a roar. Grace stepped on stage next, visibly emotional. I once thought being quiet was being professional. But now I know truth is part of the job, because no one boards a flight hoping to defend their identity at 35,000 feet. Behind them, a new video began to play, not of press conferences or hearings, but of small airports across the country where change had taken root. Skylux's new hiring events at HBCUs, young girls flying their first Cessna, engineers of color speaking at aviation expos. People once overlooked, now elevated. One clip featured a child holding a cardboard sign. Ray made me believe I belong. Ray blinked back tears. I don't want to be remembered for being slapped, she said, voice soft but unwavering. I want to be remembered for standing back up and refusing to sit down. Then she held up a small box and opened it. Inside was the staff badge Lauren Kingsley once wore, now stripped of its nameplate and fitted with a tag that read, "Retired with Lesson." She placed it in the Skylux Archives display case behind her. Symbolic. Permanent. A reminder. Outside, across hundreds of screens around the country, people watched. At airports, in schools, in homes. In break rooms where workers whispered, "That could have been me." In a quiet neighborhood in Atlanta, a high school senior named Aaliyah finished watching on her cracked phone and opened a college application. For the first time, she checked the box that said, Aviation Science. In Oakland, Thomas Jordan wiped a tear, unseen by the others at the community center. And on the final slide of the presentation behind Ray, these words appeared, "Respect is not a privilege." It's our runway. As the stream ended, Yvette leaned over and whispered, "You've just rewritten the code for the whole industry." Ray turned to her. "Not just the industry, maybe the culture too." The camera panned out one last time as Ray stepped off the stage, not above anyone, not ahead of them, but among them. A woman who had been dismissed, doubted, and struck, now walking forward, not for herself, but for the skies she wanted every child to rise into without fear. This wasn't the end. This was the new altitude. And for anyone still watching, still wondering what justice sounds like when it finally lands, it sounds a lot like silence breaking. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs hope. Subscribe to our channel for more stories where justice speaks, dignity rises, and courage finally takes flight. Because sometimes all it takes to change everything is to refuse to stay quiet.